It's 2019 inside a locked cell in Colorado. A guard slides a tray through a slot in the door like he's done 10,000 times before. No hello, no face, just the tray sliding through metal. The man inside has spent more than 35 years under a no human contact order. He called his cell a personalized coffin. He died still inside that order, never once lifted. His name was Thomas Silverstein, and this is ADX Florence, the most locked-down prison in America. Built to hold roughly 300 men, the federal system considers too dangerous, too high-profile, or too uncontrollable for anywhere else. Some of the men inside haven't heard an unmonitored voice or touched another person in years. Some weren't dangerous at all when they arrived. The building made them that way. Today, we look at 9 of them. Killers, a terrorist, a con man. Mine's this place broke completely. Stick around for the last case because it forced the federal government to admit in a courtroom exactly what this prison had been doing to the people inside it. Hit subscribe now because a place built to erase people is about to erase 9 more. Silvestre Rivera. On April 21st, 2005, inside a caged exercise pen at ADX Florence, an inmate named Silvestre Rivera stepped in for supervised recreation, alongside a 64-year-old man named Manuel Torres and a second inmate, Richard Santiago. The 3 were locked together in a cage barely large enough to hold them, standard procedure at a prison where inmates are never supposed to move through open space unsupervised. Within minutes, Rivera and Santiago were on Torres together, punching, stomping, and kicking him for nearly 2 minutes straight in a blind spot the yard's 2 cameras couldn't fully cover. Guards outside the fence couldn't reach them in time. Torres died from his injuries. It was the first inmate-on-inmate killing in the history of a facility built from the ground up, specifically to make that impossible. Rivera never denied taking part. His attorney, David Lane, told jurors Torres had put out an order to have Rivera killed, and that Torres, even from inside a cage hundreds of miles from any gang he'd once run, still had the reach to make that order stick. Video from the yard's 2 cameras captured most of it, with Santiago approaching Torres alone first, throwing the opening punch that put him directly under the camera's blind spot, before Rivera joined in. He's allowed to defend his life, Lane argued. Prosecutor M.J. Menendez rejected that account outright. He did not act in self-defense, she told the jury. Hold him accountable. The jury agreed. In 2015, a decade after the killing, Rivera was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of release, stacked on top of the sentence he was already serving. Santiago, his co-defendant, initially faced the possibility of the federal death penalty for his role in Torres's death, a distinction that made headlines out of a killing that happened inside a building most Americans didn't know existed. He would later plead guilty and receive life instead. Testimony at trial established that Rivera, Santiago, and Torres were all connected to the Mexican mafia. Torres and Santiago had already been at ADX for 5 years by the time Rivera arrived in early 2005. Within weeks of his arrival, Torres was dead. What the case exposed had nothing to do with smuggled weapons or a guard looking the other way. There was no shank, no contraband, no bribe in the incident report. 3 men had been placed together in a small metal cage for controlled, supervised recreation, and 2 of them beat the 3rd to death in full view of staff who simply couldn't get to them fast enough. ADX Florence was built around a single promise: total separation, total control, no exceptions, ever. Within a decade of opening its doors, that promise had already failed inside its own recreation yard. That failure wasn't a one-time accident either. It was a pattern the prison would repeat. Ishmael Petty. Ishmael Petty had already killed once before he ever set foot inside ADX Florence. In 1998, he was convicted for an elaborate armed bank robbery, one where he dressed as a police officer to pull it off. Then in 2002, while serving that sentence at a federal penitentiary in Louisiana, he murdered his 71-year-old cellmate, a killing that added a life sentence on top of a robbery charge. That second conviction is what finally sent him to the most secure prison in the country, the one place supposedly built to guarantee a man like him could never hurt anyone again. It didn't work. At ADX, every cell sits behind an outer door, a secure holding area, and then an inner door, a design meant to guarantee staff never enter a cell without knowing exactly where the inmate is. On September 11, 2013, Petty exploited that same design against the people who trusted it. He hid himself in the narrow space between his cell's outer and inner doors, wearing body armor made from cardboard and carrying a homemade shank. When two Bureau of Prisons librarians and a case manager arrived to deliver books, he threw hot sauce in one woman's eyes and attacked the other, severely and permanently injuring her. U.S. Attorney John Walsh later said, "The courageous intervention of a third staff member prevented the defendant from killing that librarian." Petty was convicted in 2015 and given 60 more years. Then, on September 19, 2020, while housed inside a supposedly controlled unit at ADX, Petty murdered a second fellow inmate, identified in court filings only by the initials LH. A federal grand jury indicted Petty on 2 counts, including first-degree murder, exposing him to the maximum penalty the law allows. In 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi personally authorized federal prosecutors to seek the death penalty against him, part of a broader push by her office to revive federal capital punishment after years of an executions moratorium. Acting U.S. Attorney J. Bishop Gruel filed the formal notice of intent to pursue capital punishment himself. It's one of the clearest signals yet of how seriously the government now views a killing that happened inside the walls of its own most secure facility, a facility that had already failed to stop this same man twice by the government's own accounting. Once in 1998 with a bank robbery, once in 2002 with a murdered cellmate, once again in 2013 with an ambush that nearly killed a third staff member. Petty's case isn't a story about one violent man slipping through the cracks a single time. It's the same man killing 3 separate times across 2 decades, twice inside the one prison specifically engineered to make that physically impossible. Every transfer, every added restriction, every extra decade tacked onto his sentence was supposed to be the thing that finally stopped him. None of it did. That hole in the system isn't the only thing this prison hides. Some of what happens inside its walls has nothing to do with violence breaking through. It's about a system so total that another living person is never allowed to break through it at all. Thomas Silverstein. On October 22, 1983, inside the federal penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, an inmate named Thomas Silverstein stabbed correctional officer Merle Klutz to death in a prison hallway. Hours earlier, a fellow Aryan Brotherhood member named Clayton Fountain had killed a second officer, Robert Hoffman, in a separate attack on the same unit. Silverstein was already serving time for 2 prior inmate murders. This time, the Bureau of Prisons decided an ordinary punishment would not be enough. What followed had never existed before anywhere in the federal system. Silverstein was placed under a formal no human contact order, held in cells with the lights burning around the clock, watched constantly, denied even the routine daily interaction most solitary inmates still get. He spent the following 2 decades cycling through the system's most isolated cells. A windowless underground cell at USP Atlanta, measuring 6 by 7 feet, a basement cell at Leavenworth. He did not arrive at ADX Florence, the Supermax built largely in response to what happened at Marion, until 2005, more than a decade after it opened, joining a restricted range that already held men like Ramzi Youssef. The no-contact order followed him there and was never lifted, not for a single day, for the rest of his life. He described the experience to author Pete Early as watching himself decay, piece by piece, inside what he called a personalized coffin. A Bureau of Prisons official once told Early the logic behind the order directly. The government couldn't execute Silverstein for killing a guard, so it had no choice but to make an example of him severe enough that other inmates would think twice before targeting staff. His attorneys spent years arguing the order amounted to cruel and unusual punishment. The Bureau of Prisons never budged. By the time Thomas Silverstein died in a Colorado hospital on May 11, 2019, at age 67, he had spent more than 35 years in near total isolation, believed to be the longest stretch of solitary confinement in the history of the American federal prison system. Silverstein's isolation became the template for everything ADX Florence would grow into. Every soundproof cell, every no-contact order that came after him traced back to that hallway in Marion. But he would not be the only man the government decided needed to vanish from human contact entirely. Ramzi Youssef. Ramzi Youssef arrived at ADX Florence in January of 1998, sentenced to life plus 240 years for orchestrating the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, an attack that killed 6 people and injured more than 1,000, along with a related plot to bomb a Philippine Airlines flight that killed 1 passenger outright. He was arrested in Islamabad in February of 1995 after 2 years as one of the world's most wanted men. Because of his ties to international terrorism, the Attorney General personally authorized the Bureau of Prisons to place him under special administrative measures, restrictions on mail, phone calls, media, and visitors far beyond what any other inmate in the building lived under. Under those measures, Youssef was confined to an isolated, soundproof cell, cut off from newspapers and magazines entirely, limited to censored books and pre-approved television. For years, his only regular company was the sound of his own voice inside a small concrete room, food pushed through a sally port by guards he never saw face to face. In February of 2013, after 15 years living under those exact conditions, Youssef petitioned a federal court through his attorney to have the restrictions lifted, arguing he'd maintained a clean conduct record for years and no longer had the means to build another bomb from inside a cell with no tools, no chemicals, and no contact with anyone who could supply them. The government disagreed completely. Prosecutors argued that his knowledge alone, the expertise sitting inside his head, was reason enough to keep every restriction exactly as written. The court sided with the Bureau of Prisons. The measures stayed in place, unchanged, down to the smallest detail. Youssef's own attorney called him one of the most restricted men in the entire federal system, treated, he said, as a greater national security threat than anyone outside the terrorism defendants held at Guantanamo Bay. Youssef remains at ADX today, still confined under the same restrictions he challenged more than a decade ago. He is serving 2 life sentences plus 240 years, meaning even a total legal victory in that lawsuit would never have set him free. What he was actually asking for was never freedom. It was the chance to speak to another human being without the federal government's written permission first. For Youssef, that level of isolation was justified by 6 lives and a quarter-century of consequences. For the next man on this list, there was no bombing, no body count, and no terrorism charge attached to his name at all. Jimmy Sabatino. Jimmy Sabatino built a career out of talking his way into places he had no business being. As an 18-year-old high school dropout, he scammed his way into 262 tickets for Super Bowl 29 in January of 1995, using inside information to intercept a shipment meant for a stadium box office, leaving hundreds of paying fans locked outside the gates. Over the following decades, he ran fraud schemes impersonating record executives and sports agents, at one point convincing the Los Angeles Times to run an investigative story built entirely on FBI documents he had forged himself. falsely implicating a music mogul's associates in the 1994 shooting of Tupac Shakur. The paper had to retract it. His cons were elaborate and persistent enough that federal prosecutors argued he couldn't be trusted anywhere near another human being at all. That argument won. Sabatino was placed at ADX under his own special administrative measures in a wing inmates call the Suites, 4 cells at the far end of the building, only 2 of them occupied. His only neighbor is Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the former head of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, who arrived in 2019. The 2 men are not permitted to speak to each other. Court filings show they do it anyway, shouting through the wall between their cells, day and night for years, in conversations recorded and monitored by both the Bureau of Prisons and the FBI. Sabatino's restrictions allow him to communicate with 2 people left on Earth, his attorney and his elderly stepmother, twice a month for 15 minutes at a time. Every letter he writes is read by the FBI before it reaches anyone outside. His attorney has argued in court filings that Sabatino may be the single most restricted prisoner in America, more isolated, on paper, than the drug lord sleeping 12 feet away from him. Unlike Youssef or Silverstein, Sabatino has never killed anyone. He never built a weapon or plotted an attack against a stranger. His crime was persuasion, and the government ultimately decided the only way to stop him from persuading anybody ever again was to make sure he could never speak to anybody at all. His case is proof that isolation at this level isn't reserved only for the most violent men in the system. It's reserved for anyone the government decides it can no longer risk letting talk. If Sabatino's isolation was designed to work exactly as intended, the next chapter of this list is about what happens when that same isolation stops working on the mind it was meant to control. 9 men, 1 prison, and every case in this video is public record, court filings, federal lawsuits, sworn testimony. Subscribe now if you don't want to miss the next one. And once you hear how case number 6 on this list actually ends, you'll understand exactly why we're only halfway through it. John Jack Powers. John J. Jack Powers was a 30-year-old bank robber with no history of mental illness when he witnessed an Aryan Brotherhood-linked murder inside a federal facility in Atlanta and testified against the men responsible. The threat started almost immediately. Believing the protection he'd been promised wasn't coming, Powers made a non-violent escape attempt in 1999. He was caught within 2 days. Now flagged as both a flight risk and a marked man, he was transferred to ADX Florence in October of 2001, landing on a unit that housed some of the very Aryan Brotherhood members he'd testified against. Powers had never carried a psychiatric diagnosis before that point. Inside ADX, he developed severe insomnia and crippling anxiety and was eventually diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. What followed was a documented repeating cycle. Powers would cut himself to cope, and staff would punish the self-harm as a straightforward disciplinary infraction, no different than a fistfight. The punishment pushed him further into crisis, and the cycle would restart. At his lowest point, he bit off his own pinky finger. He also amputated a testicle and part of an earlobe and cut into his own face. According to the class action lawsuit that later carried his name alongside Jeremy Pinson's and Harold Cunningham's, officials at ADX failed or refused to get him the psychiatric help his own prison file already said he urgently needed. The only thing that ever broke the cycle was distance. When Powers was transferred to a federal facility that specialized in mental health treatment, he began to recover. His insomnia eased, the cutting stopped, and then, once his file showed enough improvement, he'd be sent back to ADX again, restarting the spiral each time as if the recovery had never happened. By his own count, he spent roughly a quarter century of his life in solitary confinement across multiple institutions, for one reason or another. In 2014, after 15 years caught inside that loop, Powers walked out of the federal prison system a free man, one of the very few names on this list who can say that sentence at all. "I didn't think I was ever gonna come out of there alive," he said afterward. "I went through the flames, I went to the edge of the pits." He'd gone in a man with no diagnosis on his file. He came out with 15 years of one and a missing finger to prove it happened. Powers survived his own prison file. Not every name left on this list did. Jeremy Pinson. Jeremy Pinson's history of documented mental illness started in childhood, following years of reported abuse. She was suspended from school at age 10 for disruptive behavior, threatened to blow up her school around 6th grade, and stabbed a classmate 15 times with a pen at 13, an incident later cited in federal court as her last confirmed violent act before adulthood. In 2004, at 18, she pleaded guilty to embezzling nearly $32,000 from a congressional campaign she'd volunteered for. A year into that sentence, in August of 2005, she mailed a letter to President George W. Bush, reading, in part, "You will die soon." A jury convicted her of threatening the president, and the court departed upward from sentencing guidelines, citing her long documented history of mental illness, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and more, as an aggravating rather than mitigating factor. None of that kept her out of ADX Florence. The Bureau of Prisons sent her there in 2011, and inside its walls, her condition didn't stabilize under supervision the way her sentencing paperwork assumed it would. Prison records document at least 22 separate misconduct write-ups tied to her mental health crises, including incidents in which she smeared feces and blood across her own body and cell walls. She became one of the original named plaintiffs in the 2012 class action lawsuit against the Bureau of Prisons, standing alongside Harold Cunningham and John "Jack" Powers, a case built partly on her own psychiatric record, described by the attorneys who filed it as one of the most extensive and troubling of any prisoner housed at the facility. Pinson's own account of daily life inside ADX, published across inmate letters and court filings, described a unit where men wailed and banged on their cell walls around the clock, mutilated themselves with razors and sharpened chicken bones, and swallowed razor blades and nail clippers just to force some kind of reaction from staff who otherwise never came. She wrote about setting fires in her own cell simply to summon a supervisor for something as basic as chest pain, because no ordinary request for help ever seemed to get a response. Pinson never got the clean resolution some of the other named plaintiffs eventually did. She remained inside the federal prison system for years afterward, moved between facilities as her diagnoses shifted, her case cited again and again in later litigation as concrete proof of exactly how severe conditions inside ADX could get for a mind the prison was never equipped to treat in the first place. Even Pinson's later legal filings, arguing for a reduced sentence based on her deteriorating health and her particular vulnerability as a transgender woman in the federal system, were denied. A court found it nearly impossible to conclude she was no longer a danger to others, the same institutional logic that had kept her inside ADX in the first place. Powers cut himself and lived. Pinson set fires and kept deteriorating year after year with no clean ending yet. The next man on this list never even got the chance to do either for very long. Robert Knott. Robert Knott was diagnosed with schizophrenia in 1990, 2 years after his conviction for a multi-state kidnapping spree that had turned deadly, committed when he was 23. Both of his adoptive parents had died by the time he was 15. Bureau of Prisons policy explicitly prohibited placing severely mentally ill inmates in solitary confinement of any kind. In 2002, after a stay in a mental hospital where he'd reported seeing white bugs crawling in his cell, the Bureau sent Knott to ADX Florence anyway. He stayed there for the next 11 years. Fellow inmates later told investigators that Knott rarely left his cell for recreation, kept his window covered at all hours, and grew visibly, noticeably worse as the years passed without treatment, isolated even by the standards of a prison where isolation was already the baseline. In the final week of his life, that decline accelerated in full view of staff. According to a letter written by another prisoner after Knott's death became public, "I would see and hear officers peeking in his cell and whispering to each other like he was some sort of spectacle. They never notified the lieutenant or mental health staff about his bizarre behavior. No one intervened." Records later showed the Bureau of Prisons had already flagged Knott as a candidate for transfer to a psychiatric treatment program in Atlanta, a transfer that never happened in time. On September 7, 2013, Robert Knott hanged himself in his cell with a bedsheet. He was 48, the seventh inmate confirmed to have taken his own life inside ADX Florence. His body was found still shackled, restrained even in death, a standard practice at the facility that his family's attorneys would later point to as emblematic of how little dignity Knott had been afforded in his final decade. His family sued the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act. Rather than fight the claim through a full trial, the Department of Justice settled just weeks after the lawsuit was filed, agreeing to pay $175,000 with no admission of fault attached. Attorney Catherine Stimson, who represented Knott's family, called his death another tragic example of our government's mistreatment of the mentally ill. $175,000 was the final price the government paid for 11 years spent watching a diagnosed schizophrenic man deteriorate in direct violation of its own written policy until he was simply gone. Knott's suicide came after 6 other ADX inmates had already killed themselves inside the same facility. It would not be the last time a mentally ill man's case forced the Bureau of Prisons to answer for what isolation at ADX had done to him. But the next case wouldn't end quietly with a private settlement check. It would end in a federal courtroom on the record for every man like him still locked inside. Harold Cunningham. Harold Cunningham is serving a life sentence plus 380 years for a series of crimes that included murder. In 1996, during a state trial where he was representing himself, he stabbed a witness in open court in front of the judge and jury. He was formally diagnosed as severely mentally ill afterward. When he arrived at ADX Florence in 2001, that diagnosis should have kept him out of the facility's most restrictive control unit entirely. Instead, he was taken off his prescribed medication and placed there anyway because the control unit's own internal rules didn't permit psychiatric medication for anyone housed inside it, no matter what their file said. Cunningham became the lead plaintiff in what was originally filed as Bacote versus Federal Bureau of Prisons in June of 2012 by 11 ADX inmates, including John Jack Powers and Jeremy Pinson, alleging chronic neglect of the seriously mentally ill population at the facility. The complaint described a unit where men wailed and banged on their cell walls without end, mutilated themselves with whatever objects they could find, and were denied real psychiatric care even after their conditions were already documented in their own prison files. At one point, Cunningham was given a single remote psychiatric session with an outside doctor while handcuffed from behind and surrounded on all sides by correction officers, unable to speak freely even to his own psychiatrist. For 4 years, the case moved through discovery in front of U.S. District Judge Richard Matsch, who refused multiple early government requests to dismiss it outright. Throughout the litigation, the Bureau of Prisons never once admitted to a specific Eighth Amendment violation against any individual plaintiff or to any systemic failure at the facility. The settlement, when it came, was framed by the government purely as new policy going forward, not an acknowledgement of past wrongdoing. Attorney Ed Arrow, who built the original complaint, spent those years documenting conditions in far more detail than any single inmate account could manage alone, work that became the backbone of what the settlement would eventually require the government to fix. On December 29, 2016, Judge Match formally approved a sweeping settlement. The Bureau of Prisons agreed to new mandatory mental health screening at intake, at transfer, and continuously throughout an inmate's time at ADX. It lifted the outright ban on psychotropic medication inside the control unit, the same ban once used against Cunningham himself. It built confidential, private spaces for real psychiatric consultations, no longer conducted in chains and surrounded by guards. Within the settlement's first year, nearly 100 mentally ill men like Powers, Pinson, and Knott, were transferred out of ADX Florence entirely, moved to facilities actually equipped to treat them. The court didn't simply close the case and move on either. Judge Match retained jurisdiction to enforce the settlement's terms, appointing an outside monitor to track the Bureau of Prisons' compliance for years afterward, a level of ongoing federal oversight almost never applied to a facility the government had spent 3 decades describing as its most secure and best-run prison. The case that carried Harold Cunningham's name accomplished something none of the individual tragedies before it could manage alone. It didn't just win money for one family or one man, it forced the United States government to admit, on the record, in a federal courtroom, in front of a judge who refused to look away, that the prison built to control the worst of the worst had spent years quietly destroying the minds of men it was never supposed to be holding in the first place. If this list left you with more questions than answers about what actually happens behind those walls, that's the point, because that's exactly how the Bureau of Prisons has operated for 30 straight years, one soundproof cell at a time. 9 men, killers, a terrorist, a con man, and the ones the system simply broke. Some are still there right now, in cells with no bars and one small window, waiting on appeals, waiting on transfers, waiting on nothing at all. Thanks for watching.